people suddenly feel in the presence of celebrity.
It is just an iconic symbol of the Olympic Games.
Because it has such an amazing sort of power and an energy running through it.
There's a marvellous photograph of Marilyn Monroe, celebrity, embracing the discus thrower, celebrity.
It was a very popular statue in Antiquity. There were many Roman copies.
Metaphorically, it becomes a sculpture about containing those wild forces of nature, actually taming those forces of nature and holding them, which is fantastic when you consider he's just about to throw the disc and it's just on the edge of your seat as all these forces are sort of ready to be unleashed, and he holds them and contains them, and it's there forever.
Discobolos never really loses its appeal, and in fact increased its appeal as it became more and more the icon of the Greek body beautiful, the idea in marble of what many people longingly, wistfully regret, which is the disappearance of the Greek original athletic statues that were made in bronze.
The sculpture was made by Myron in the 5th century BC. It's a bronze sculpture, it's not a stone sculpture, and a lot of sculptures that are Greek have been copied by the Romans, who greatly admired them, and copied into marble. So we always have to think about the sculpture as being bronze originally rather than stone.
Myron trained in the workshop of a sculptor called Agelidas at Argos, which was a famous city for bronzesmiths. And his fellow school pupils were Phidias and Polykleitos. So you can imagine the three most famous sculptors of the 5th century BC all together in this hothouse of tutorship under the great sculptor Agelidas.
Bronze was ideal for creating statues of athletes because it had that tensile strength and it enabled the limbs to be stretched out into different poses, positions to be used, which the Greek sculptors very much enjoyed being able to achieve. Marble, on the other hand, is much more fragile, brittle, and so in the Roman marble copies of the statue you find sometimes a tree trunk is introduced beside the legs to support the structure.
I think the key to understanding the idea of the discus thrower, of the discobolos of Myron, is that it is not a representation of a naturalistic rendering of an athlete. It is an artificial construct intended to present the perfect man according to the values of harmony, balance, rhythm, and proportion that was so intensely valued, not only in Greek art, but also in Greek philosophy. One of the characteristic features of ideal Greek sculpture, of the male body beautiful, is that it is represented nude. This is extraordinary and unique to Greece in the ancient world. The other question which I'm often asked in respect of ideal Greek sculpture is, why are the genitals so small? And once that question has been asked, what man dare deny it? The answer is that it's because the sculpture is not about sex. Sexual awareness is not the message of the ideal Greek sculpture. The young men of the athlete statues are all aprosopoi. They are faceless, types. They represent not one particular beauty, not one individual's beauty, but beauty itself. He does not punch the air and project his hips forward like the contemporary triumphant footballer. He looks down and away from his observers, and in so doing, marks himself out as somebody in possession of sophrosyne. He does nothing to provoke the physical desire that the others have for him. And this is, of course, a fulfillment of the idea of kalogagathia, of physical and moral beauty.
I think that there's always been a kind of celebration of youth and a celebration of sort of strength and beauty in the human form, and that Greek sculpture captured that quite amazingly. I don't know if there's ever been anything since that. It's sort of the Olympics is kind of similar, this sort of celebration of movement and grace and strength, because it is something that's fleeting and that is kind of has that sort of transitory beauty about it.
The human figure in Greek art, pleasingly, from the point of view of those of us who study it, develops over time. So you can see a progression from the stiff, conceptual, symbolic representation of the human body through the late 6th century BC into the 5th century, when the figure becomes more naturalistic.
What we're seeing is a Greek reinterpretation of Egyptian sculpture, but taking it into human realms. This sculpture is emulating a real movement, okay? And movement is built into the sculpture. He's got his weight equally distributed between his legs. So in that position, you can start to move forward, okay? Can you see the pelvis is starting to stick through the skin? And so we're starting to have flesh. Although it's got a lot more movement, okay, so he's looking in that direction, his pelvis is going in that direction, and his legs are facing this way. There's a sort of breaking up of that strict frontwards, sideways version of events. You need to use geometry or a use of line to create big shapes, and then break those big shapes down into smaller shapes. But it's a sort of idealized form which describes the body as parts, and each part has to be there. The body was sort of segmented and created in little units. And what the people were trying to do is make those units harmonize with one another.
That idea of balance, contrast, rhythm is written into the Discus Thrower of Myron in a very considerable way. For example, the one arm extends behind, engaged with the discus. The other arm hangs free. The torso faces the viewer. The legs are seen in profile. One leg bears the weight. The other leg is weight-free. One set of toes curl up. The other set of toes arch under, like springs ready to release stored action.
Discus throwing began centuries and centuries ago when the Greeks first realised that the small flat pebbles that you find on the beach travelled much further and faster than the round ones. And it was not very long afterwards that they started using other objects, in this case metal ingots, which was sometimes actually also the prize for the event.
Now men come forward, compete to win this prize. Big Epius hefted the iron, swung and heaved it. Then Ajax came up third, and the giant flung it hard with his rippling, brawny arm to pass all other marks. But then Polypoetes braced for battle, took the weight, and far as a seasoned herdsman flings his throwing staff, whirling in flight across his cows to keep them all in line, so far he out-hurled the whole field.
Well, the physique of ancient discus throwers was very different from that today. They were much lither. They seem to be much more supple because they're less muscled. The discus throwers nowadays tend to look relatively chunky, whereas in Antiquity, the discus throwers were renowned for their physiques because the Greeks admired bodies which were not overdeveloped in any particular area.
The ideal Greek sculpture is like the naked athlete who competes in the games at Olympia or one of the other great athletic events of the Greek world, where the runner would run naked, but would not be expected to get an erection. He would be disregarded by his fellow Greeks if he were to express himself in any other way than as an athlete.
All athletes in Antiquity performed naked, both in exercise and in competition. But as the runners were going through a particular archway, it was the custom for spectators to slap their bottoms as they went through. Indeed, there were various theories about why athletes perform naked, because it seems originally they wore a kind of shorts or loincloth, which was discarded. So there was a story about an athlete lost his shorts or loincloth, tripped over it as it fell. So from then on, a law was passed that athletes should perform naked to avoid any future accidents. The real reason is that the Greeks trained for months and years to achieve their muscular perfection, and they were extremely pleased to show this off. Discus throwing was part of the pentathlon. Pentathlon means 5 contests. So there was discus throwing, javelin throwing, the long jump, running and wrestling. And all of those 5 contests at the Olympic Games were held on one afternoon. And we don't actually know the method of deciding the winner, but it seems as though if an athlete won the first 3 events, then probably the running and the wrestling would be cancelled. So discus throwers were known, as were athletes from the pentathlon generally, for being swift of foot and also strong, very versatile athletes, and considered the most beautiful.
Phlegeus of Pisa first roughens the discus and his own hand with earth. Then, shaking off the dust, he turns it dexterously to see which side best suits his fingers, or fits more snugly the middle of his arm. He had always loved this sport and used to practice throwing the discus across the Alpheus, where the banks are furthest apart, always clearing the river and never getting the discus wet.
It's been a tough weekend, but back to training now. I'm number 1 in the UK, and I'm 3 in the world, 3rd in the world at the moment, so I'm in a good place, but I just got to stay healthy, stay fit, and I should have a good time there.
Oh yes, that's very close. Good boy.
When you're in the Olympic arena, as Lawrence will be, as one of the favourites, he's going to have 80,000 people screaming at him when he walks into the circle with a Union Jack on his chest, and that's going to be a hell of a pressure for him to have to deal with. But, you know, we're working on it, but that's very hard to recreate in training.
Yeah, John's helped me out massively, and he's been around the game for a long time, and he's seen a lot of throws, and he's produced a lot of very talented athletes, and he's worked really well with me.
Oh, okay, so next throw, concentrate on dropping the left knee in, okay? Don't collect your discs.
Yeah, the discus in competition weighs 2 kilos. So yeah, I train with lighter and heavier discs, but today I'm throwing the competition weight. But yeah, so it's 2 kilos.
There are about 20 discuses that survive from Antiquity. They're all varying weights, sizes. They vary between about 35 centimetres across. The weights of these, this smaller one is about 1.25 kilos. This one about 2. This one's rather massive, it's 4 kilograms. So that's a pretty heavy object to throw. The method of throwing the discus in Antiquity was very different. Nowadays, athletes spin about 2.5 times using centrifugal force, but in ancient times, they used barely a 3/4 turn. I think people generally agree that the pose of the discobolos is virtually impossible to achieve. And what the artist seems to be doing there is to capture the essence of the movement, and that he does very skillfully.
No, you can't throw like this. But it's not that far off, but you're not going to throw far like that. Like when I do my stands, I don't know if you notice, this is how I start. Shoulders level, knee bent here, whereas the hip's down, this arm's up. Gravity wants to pull your arm down, so it's not actually going to be able to throw far like that. But they throw on the podium with nowhere to go, so it's a statue, so.
I think it's safe to say that the head is potentially not in the right way. If you imagine a discus thrower, the position that he has, he's in action, he's about to throw the discus, the motion is all wrong. You might want to see where you're throwing it, but in order to hold out, you look back and then you throw out, so your head turns the other way. So while the discus is in the outstretched arm, the head should be looking for it.
We now know, of course, that that head belongs to a statue not of the 5th century, but of the 4th century BC, not by Myron, but by another sculptor called Lysippus, and is an erroneous restoration. When in 1781, there emerged from an excavation in Rome a complete, near complete marble version with its head, looked back at the hand that held the discus. Our discobolos, the so-called Townley discobolos, it was found without its head. An ancient head was said to lie nearby and was claimed by the dealer, Thomas Jenkins, to have been the original, and he fitted that head to the body. Charles Townley was the great antiquary of the 18th century who was destined to buy this statue. The discus thrower was one of the last and one of the most expensive of his acquisitions. Townley dies in 1805, and his collection of sculpture comes to the British Museum and is one of the great founding collections of the early museum.
There is something about him, the way he looks forward, that gives him a little bit of something extra. Maybe because it's wrong, he's so exciting, I don't know.
The Nazis bought the discobolos, the Lancelotti discobolos. It was all tied up with this idea that the Greek body beautiful was the representation of the Aryan race. In 1948, the British were preparing for the Olympic Games, the first Games to be held since the Nazi Olympics, the Berlin Olympics of 1936. And Our discus thrower appears famously on the London Transport poster, hovering over the Palace of Westminster. And the meaning of this juxtaposition is clear. The discus thrower represents ancient Greece, the world's oldest democracy, and Palace of Westminster represents the freedom of the moral West over a tyrant, and the idea of the world's longest continuing democracy. And so, once again, the discus thrower becomes a paradigm of the values that are associated with the idea of Greece, with the idea of the valuing of the individual freedom of every citizen, the idea of moral virtue as part of physical beauty.
It's a long bolt, that one. I know. Yeah. Right, let's get this off.
The Townley Discobolos is about to experience another great moment in its history as a world icon of ancient Greek art, when it will be displayed prominently in the Great Court of the British Museum as the first object in an exhibition about the ancient Olympic Games.
Should get enough just to get the air. Right, okay. I'll keep it tight this side because it's... Does that say front? Yeah, excellent, right. Let's try that. Got gloves. What was half? 60. Yeah, they're right.
Sides be all right, mate.
He said there's a little more at the top.
The Discobolos is wonderfully glamorous, don't you think? And people feel good when they're in front of beautiful people. And so we feel good when we're in front of beautiful representations of beautiful people. He brings a smile to everybody's face, and there are very few of us who can resist a photo opportunity of bending forwards and lifting our arm and impersonating the discus thrower. He charms everyone he meets, and he not only does he please us visually, but he also instructs us intellectually about the values that lay behind his creation as a representation of one who is fair of face and sound of heart.